coming in and for logging in online, and welcome to this semester's first PCC Forum. PCC Forum is a place where students, alumni, professors, and guests all come together to share new and old ideas and to contemplate and be in community and have awesome conversations. I want to thank you for being here to begin with, and thank you, Matt and Lily and Ashton, for being so helpful in transitioning over the forum to Matt and I. We have three scheduled for this semester. This is the first one. We have another one on the 21st of November and then the 11th of December. And if y'all want to get involved for next semester, please reach out to either me or Matt. And with that said, bring you up.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to introduce these lovely professors here. I'm sure most of you all know them. But for those who don't, I have a little description, official one. So Robert, PhD, president of CIS from 1990 to 1999. Except for 11 years as a higher education administrator, he has been teaching philosophy and comparative religion since 1964. Published extensively on Sri Aurobindo and Rudolf Steiner, including Steiner and Kindred Spirits. Secretary of the American Academy of Religion, senior Fulbright lecturer at the Open University, and director of a national endowment for the Humanities Project for the study of Hinduism and Buddhism. And for 14 years, he's chair of the board of the Sophia Project, two homes in Oakland for mothers and children at risk of homelessness. He has been president and board chair of many other institutions. And just as a personal note, I will say that every single official PCC party I've gone to, he's always been the faculty member who's always there. He's was my first response when we tried to start the Metaphysical Club, and so he's always a favorite of mine to hear and to speak with, so thank you, Robert. Matt Segall, PhD, received his doctoral degree in 2016 from the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIS. His dissertation, Cosmotheanthropic Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead, grapples with the limits to knowledge of reality imposed by Kant's transcendental form of philosophy and argues that Schelling and Whitehead's process-oriented approach, described in his dissertation as a descendental form of philosophy, shows the way across the Kantian threshold to renewed experiential contact with reality. He teaches courses on German idealism and process philosophy for the PCC program at CIS and blogs regularly at footnotestopplato.com. And I should also say, just as a kind of personal intro, I was in the program in 2009, but I was hanging out in Oregon. So I was getting the chance to sort of try to figure out what PCC was all about. And Matt, your Holons network with Math Fails and all of that was really helpful and instructive to kind of get an introduction to the PCC program. So I think it's only fitting that these two guys are going to be kicking off the PCC Forum tonight, this year. So I thank you all for that. Also, we have drinks over here. No food. We thought we wouldn't want to spoil the drink. So please do help yourself. And we clearly have, I think, a bottle for each of you. And then if any of you somehow figured out how to come here without being on the PCC listserv, there's a little list for you to write your email should you be inspired to come to more of these. So on that note, I think that is it. I won't say much about what they're going to be talking about. I think they'll do that themselves. But let's give a warm welcome to Robert.
Thanks to Matt and to Aya for carrying this philosophical PCC forum, which has a distinguished history. You probably can remember the lineage, but it was
Adam Robert picked it up
Yeah,
in 2009.
right.
He and Jamie
Sochi.
Sochi were holding it for a few years, and then Becca and myself picked it up, and
Right.
then Travis and Lily picked it up,
Yeah.
and then Ashton and Natalie picked it up, and then now these are our two newest
I think there was like an
facilitators.
interdisciplinary forum
Yeah.
at one point.
Yeah. So
Who did that one?
that was Adam.
That was Adam's idea,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
So I knew you would know. Well, welcome everyone, thanks for coming. We have a plan. I'm going to start saying a little bit about the book by Steiner that's behind the book, that's behind what we're saying tonight, to let you know the sort of the initial impulse articulation. It's a chapter, or no, it's a lecture in Human and Cosmic Thought, 4 lectures, and the one that Mario Betti drew from is lecture 2, which Steiner delivered on the 21st of January, 1914. I think you should notice the date, 1914. I'll say something about that. And lecture 2 is called The Possibility of Contemplating the World from 12 Different Standpoints through 12 Equally Justified World Outlooks. Now, for somebody like Steiner, who is so well known for his strong opinions and his affirmations and his argument on behalf of certain positions, for him to say that there are 12 worldviews and they are equally justifiable is quite, to my mind, remarkable. He's certainly beyond what I can affirm or even, dare I say, want to affirm. I know it's a good exercise to do this. At the same time, I don't know where we'll finish about how. I mean, we both have philosophical convictions, so we'll see how that plays. So I wanted you to know about the book. It's very readable. Of course, it's lectures, so it therefore makes it kind of inviting. And I want to say that in the first lecture, Steiner talks about the history of thinking. So since he's an advocate of the evolution of consciousness, this is a very important distinction. He doesn't just talk about the history of thought, the history of ideas. He is very clear there is a history of the way of thinking. And he says that thinking, as we do automatically without being conscious of how we're doing it in the modern West, came about, he thinks, pretty dramatically differently in around the 15th century in the West. But he says way back, there was thinking which was mostly pictorial, and that it was a slow and dramatic transition. He thinks around the, say, 8th to 5th to 2nd or 3rd century BCE, when more and more of these thinkers in India, somewhat China, but especially in Greece, were able to make this transition from thinking pictorially to thinking in abstract ideas. And in his view, of course, the two great champs are Plato and Aristotle, who will be hovering tonight, because that's sort of what we're talking about, variations on Plato and Aristotle. And as some of you know, Matt has you're still running your foot.
In all my free time, I do
all your free
blog
time,
on
which
occasion.
is I think at 2 a.m., 2 until 3. Maybe you should say a word about it. Footnotes to Plato.
Well, I mean, as Matt mentioned, I've been doing philosophy online for a long time, trying to be in conversation. I mean, it's relevant to this theme with people who are very different from me, and the internet has it came onto the scene with a lot of promise to bring the world together, and it has seemingly done the opposite. But I'm still trying. I like to engage with people on whether it's politics or philosophy, people that are very different from me. And I've been doing it since, I think, 2006, 2007, when YouTube was, the servers were in someone's garage down in Palo Alto before Google purchased them. and I still continue to do it today. Footnotes to Plato is the name of my blog, but it's a reference to Alfred North Whitehead, who famously said that all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. All the problems that we still struggle with were in Plato's dialogues. I mean, a lot of the potential solutions are there, but Plato also came up with the refutations of the solutions as well. So,
yeah, and something I've written, I located today, quoted the passage that Matt is referring to, and I introduced it by saying it is almost always misquoted.
Yeah.
It's actually a very careful and I think very interesting quotation. He says the safest generalization of Western philosophy is it consists in footnotes to Plato. And then he goes on and says something I had completely forgotten about how, by which I mean that he, by his historical circumstance, his genius, etc., he basically created the context, and then Whitehead says, within which I am working, which I was really happy to see that. So we are talking about ideas and thinking, particularly thinking in 12 ways or 12 paradigms, which Steiner recommends, I would say, as a spiritual activity. That it is important in our time, and strong emphasis on our time, that we think, it's like in the philosophical shoes of these people with whom we disagree. And so Matt is going to talk about Mario Betti and the book that we were asked to write a foreword for. And I just want to say a little bit more about the philosophical situation that Steiner discerned, namely where it becomes more and more difficult for people with intellectual standpoint commitments to understand, even to tolerate other points of view. And so I think of Steiner and William James, who were writing at the same time, and James said that philosophy is a series of alternatives. It was easy for him to say because he actually didn't settle very much. He was delighted by the variety of opinions, many of which he held himself. So he wasn't sort of as much of an advocate of as Steiner. But Steiner, this is now in 1914, there is not one worldview that can be defended that is legitimate, but 12. And it has to be admitted that there are just as many good reasons for one worldview as for one of the other 12. The world cannot be regarded from one standpoint outlook of one worldview, one thought, but reveals itself only to those who know that one must circumnavigate it. Just as in the Copernican worldview, the sun passes through the signs of the zodiac, shining upon the earth from 12 different regions, so likewise we should not position ourselves upon a single standpoint, that say of idealism or sensualism, phenomenalism, or any other outlook that can be named. But instead, we should be able to encircle the world and live our way into the 12 different perspectives from which the world can be regarded. I think it's quite a strong statement from somebody who has very strong commitments. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. Okay, just to conclude, one of my favorite lines from Plato in the Republic, Plato says, thinking begins when conflicting perceptions arise. And so one of the services of this book, first of the lecture by Steiner and then the book by Mario Betti, is that it forces us into, let's say, 11 conflicts, right? The one that we're thinking about, and then the other 11 that are distinctly different, and in some cases, strongly different. So that gets us thinking if we're at all open to it. And I think maybe I will stop there and turn to Matt.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Robert. So, as Robert started talking about there are different historical worldviews that humanity moves through. You might think of someone like Jean Gebser as describing a movement from an archaic to a magical to a mythical to a mental or rational, and then potentially an integral structure of consciousness, right? So we move through these historically. What Steiner is doing here, as I understand it, is, he's giving this lecture in 1914. He's giving a snapshot of the possibilities for consciousness today, right? For a consciousness that's thinking in abstract concepts, not in terms of pictures or stories or magic spells, as past forms of consciousness may have, but for a consciousness that's primarily rational, or striving to be, that's thinking in terms of concepts. These are, for Steiner, the 12 possibilities. Now, he admits there might be some other sort of in-between possibilities, but I think for the purposes of simplification, he says these are the 12. They correspond to zodiac signs. I'm not going to go too much into that. But what Betti is doing is bringing Steiner's insight into these 12 possibilities as articulated in 1914, just as World War I is about to begin.
Yeah. 6 months later.
So there's tension in Europe. Nationalism is about to boil over, right? And so this is a very serious topic. This is not just philosophical, abstract speculation. This is how do we live together? And Betti is picking up where Steiner left off in our postmodern age, when, we see this every day, where there's people who basically have private worldviews. We inhabit more and more as social media feeds us the narrative and the news that fits our pre-existing prejudices. We inhabit a sort of solipsistic space where we're unable to communicate with people, whether it's across the political aisle or culturally, different forms of identity that prevent us from understanding others. And so there's this great danger of postmodern relativism, of the private worldview, and we lack a sense of cultural belonging that could transcend these private identities. Betti is trying to draw on Steiner to speak to this postmodern condition. How can we not just tolerate difference, tolerate other worldviews, but how can we risk our own sense of identity and self-understanding and world understanding in an encounter with others to recognize the full humanity that transcends any of our narrow perspectives? From Steiner's point of view, the human being, this is what I would call, it's not just a cosmogram or a picture of the cosmos, it's an anthropocosmogram. It's a picture of the human cosmic relationship. So the human being is somehow an integration of all of these possibilities. And Steiner is trying to get us to step into a mode of consciousness that, inescapably, we're going to be drawn to some of these perspectives more than others. But he wants us to inhabit a mode of consciousness that is fully human, that can take in all of the possibilities of human experience and human understanding. So, worldview it's a term that it relates to our conception of individuals, how individuals relate to society or to a community, how we conceive of the possibility of action. Are we free or are we not free? What does the future look like? Our worldview tells us where we came from and where we're going. Often there's some religious component. Maybe there's a God, maybe not. Maybe the soul is immortal, maybe not. How do we make meaning? Whether we're religious or not, where do we derive our sense of meaning, our sense of personal destiny? There's scientific aspects to worldviews, artistic aspects, religious aspects. So each one of these worldviews is drawing on the nature of the human being and emphasizing one or another of our capacities, right? But in order to become a full human being, we're trying to realize the whole. So Steiner and Betti, they're trying to avoid these two dangers. One is relativism, as I mentioned. The other is exclusivism. So as Robert read in this quote, each one of these worldviews has very good reasons, very good justifications. People can argue fully, consistently, convincingly for materialism. I'm going to try to do that in a second. For idealism, right? For dynamism. There's a self-consistent completeness to each of these worldviews, and yet, when we try to fully understand the potential of our humanity, we have to be willing to risk what we thought we knew in order to encounter difference and be transformed by it. So Betti says, initially he says, tolerance is a good place to start, but it's not the end point. We need more than tolerance. Tolerance is like, yeah, I don't really get what you're doing, but as long as you stay over there, I'll tolerate that. What Betti is calling for is not just tolerance, but recognition, acknowledgement, a welcoming of the difference, and a willingness to risk oneself in the encounter with difference so that we might be transformed. And this is hard because you might be willing to encounter difference and transform, but the person you're encountering is not, right? So was it Martin Luther King Jr. who said, I cannot be who I am supposed to be until you are who you are supposed to be, and vice versa, right? That's the situation we're in, so it takes a lot of trust. So we're looking for a deep pluralism here that's deep enough that it doesn't deny unity. It's a unity in diversity, right? A shallower form of pluralism or multiculturalism would just be based on tolerance, where it's like, you stay in your neighborhood, I'll stay in my neighborhood, you get your aisle at the grocery store, I get my aisle at the grocery store. That's a shallow form of multiculturalism that doesn't require us to transform, right? And it's not that we're trying to eradicate difference, but we need to be able to really get inside of the worldview of others, right? So this book and Steiner's lecture, it's an exercise in thinking, a challenge to us to try to inhabit worldviews that we're not that comfortable with. And the more we can do that, the more human we become.
Absolutely.
So shall we try to
I didn't read something I intended to read. It comes right out of William James, and so many things come out of William James and unacknowledged. This is from Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos, which we faculty colleagues read together a couple years ago. Philosophy has to proceed comparatively. The best we can do is to develop the rival alternative conceptions in each important domain as fully and carefully as possible, depending on our antecedent sympathies, and see how they measure up. That is a more credible form of progress than decisive proof or refutation. Now that, I think, is quite helpful and positive, and of course, it'd be great if philosophers did that. But Steiner and Betti are going one further. They're not just saying we should consider, as Matt said, I think convincingly, we need to engage, and we need to sort of to take into our thinking these opposite points of view. Much more difficult than Nagel, though Nagel himself is, and James are advances on what actually happens. I'm going to read another passage. This is from Albert William Levy's Philosophy in the Modern World, who wrote, philosophical movements of the recent past are to be viewed as waves of successive reform beating upon an infinite shore, with each group of partisans committed to a conception of philosophy which assure them a virtual monopoly of its legitimate practice. And to pragmatists, logical empiricists, and linguistic analysts alike, and I think it would be true of all 12 of these, any alternative conception of what philosophy is rests upon a tragic mistake. Right, so Steiner and Betti are way past that, and we're trying to be as well. Okay.
So there's 12 worldviews, and Robert and I were thinking, wow, that's 5 minutes per worldview, and that might fit into an hour, and so, but when we really got down to it, we figured that was too tight of a schedule. We're not going to try to do all 12, might mention something about each one, but here they all are, and these are philosophical worldviews, right? There are different ways to think about worldviews. You could have cultural worldviews, and this is focusing on the philosophical possibilities. There's 4 quadrants here, right? So This quadrant over here has to do with the worldviews of will. This quadrant here, the worldviews of sensing, right? So this is willing, sensing. This is feeling. And this is thinking over here. So what Robert and I are going to do, I'm going to start with materialism. We'll start at the bottom. I'm just kidding. It's not the worst worldview. It's going to be, it's a real exercise, though, to try to inhabit the materialist worldview and try to understand what is valuable in it. Then Robert's going to give the contrasting polar worldview of spiritism. Then I'm going to do realism. Actually, you're going to do idealism. Then I'll do realism, because realism is special.
Yeah, we're both realists, but you're not supposed to know that.
So the thing about this circle is that opposite worldviews, whether it's on the 4 quadrants or say like phenomenalism and psychism, pneumatism and sensualism, or sensualism, they're opposites, and yet they enhance one another in their opposition. Right? So rather than thinking of them as negating one another, they actually, when rightly understood and participated in, they enhance one another. Right? That's at least the challenge for thinking and understanding that Betti and Steiner are
And this is what Owen Barfield means by polarity.
Polarity.
When
right.
it's not just contrast or opposite, it's opposites that engage in a way that enhance the other in the very opposition. It's a very specific concept that he works with.
Yep. So materialism, as Robert mentioned, after around 1500, materialism started to become the dominant worldview in the West, right? In Europe, North America, and all of the places where the West touched, which was the whole planet. And the materialistic worldview, it does have a lot to do with the so-called age of exploration, as European ships traveled across the Atlantic, traveled around the Horn of Africa into the East, discovering space for the first time, really starting to inhabit this sense of a spatially extended world, right? Perspectival painting in the Renaissance, right? Again, the sense of space and extension is birthing a new perspective where human beings see themselves inhabiting a space with the potential to master the matter that inhabits that space. So when we're inhabiting the worldview of materialism, we're thinking in terms of an exploration of the planet and of a sense of great technological potential. The materialistic worldview is what gets us germ theory. We start to understand how disease has a micro organismic basis, right? Really valuable insight. We get a sense for physical science, which is understanding, as Descartes taught us, the way that matter exists in this geometrically extended realm. We can mathematically understand it, though already materialism is starting to bleed into mathematism. As science develops, it moves more in that direction. In the scientific revolution, thinkers like Kepler and Newton were undermining this ancient Aristotelian differentiation between the sublunary spheres of Earth, where there's physical stuff going on, and the supralunary spheres of all the other stars beyond the moon, where there's something spiritual going on. There's a whole different kind of causality for the ancient imagination in that super or supralunary sphere than there is here on the Earth. But what the first scientists in the 17th century were discovering is that there are laws that transcend that boundary. So when Kepler writes about celestial physics, just in that phrase already, there's an expansion of this materialistic outlook. For Aristotle, there's no physics in the sky. There's no matter up there. These are far subtler spiritual happenings, right? So Kepler is talking about celestial physics. Newton is talking about heavenly mechanics. So all of a sudden, the laws that apply to the terrestrial realm that cause the apples to fall are the same laws that are causing the planets to orbit around the sun, right? One universal law of gravitation. So when we think about the power of gravity to forge worlds, to forge planets and stars, this is a materialistic insight, right? Mass, right? Whitehead is a good example of a thinker who wants to do justice to materialism. But what happens in the 20th century is that materialism, this effort to reduce down the nature of matter to its smallest components, materialism ends up discovering that, well, actually matter has more dynamism and more of a mathematical quality. So when you really push one worldview to its extreme, you discover that it's connected to these other worldviews. Now, there's another dimension to materialism if we think about it in a religious context. There's a Christian mystic who lived around the time of the German Idealists, late 1700s, Friedrich Christoph Ettinger. And he said, corporeality or embodiment is the end of the ways of God. Corporeality is the end of the ways of God. So God is aiming for materialization. And this is a way of thinking of what the mystery of incarnation is all about. We don't want to overlook the fact that one of the most important religions in human history has emphasized the fact that the divine became a human body and died, right? And there's something mysterious, more mysterious about materialism than meets the eye if we really live into that mystery. And I'll just bring materialism to a close by, I want to read a few lines from a poem that Goethe wrote while he was in a crypt holding his good friend Schiller's skull in his hand, right? Materialism is the bones that give structure to our bodies, right? We've all been there.
Wow, I'd forgotten that. Ooh.
52. So Goethe says, he picks up the skull and he says, I felt a sudden rush of warmth and joy as if from death a source of life rose up. What strange delight, what rapt devotion, that form preserving such a godlike trace, the skull. A look transporting me towards that ocean whose rolling billows mightier shapes embrace. Mysterious vessel, oracular, I am unworthy to hold you in my hand, unless to bear your form, O greatest treasure, from this moldy prison back to the free air, to sunlight clear. Can there be knowledge of any greater worth than God in nature revealed to us? Than learning how nature from solid forms of earth lets the spirit issue. How nature from solid forms of earth lets the spirit issue. How long tended it preserves what spirit first engendered. So that's materialism. And now
You mentioned spirit, though. I'm a little confused. Does that violate the materialism a tiny bit?
Well, it's pointing out the way that in the bone, that spirit needs the bones to fully realize itself, I think is Goethe's point there.
Right.
And Goethe's never just in one worldview or another, right? So he's always, and it's really hard to just be in one of these worldviews. We can try really hard to just be a materialist, and despite ourselves, we're going to be drawing on, how many materialists can talk about nature without referencing math, without referencing, the wave-like nature of light, which is more of a dynamic worldview. So it's really hard to stay fixed, which is helpful.
Especially hard for Goethe.
Especially.
So Goethe wrote, nothing alive is one thing alone, but always manifold diversity. It's a lot of integralism tonight, if you notice. Okay, thanks, Matt. Wonderful. For a person who's not merely a materialist, you did a good job. But you're also a pro-matter person, and therefore
Yeah.
you made the case,
Yeah.
which is what we're here to do. So I'm to speak about spiritualism, and I want to begin by talking about the word. Should it be spiritism or spiritualism? Well, we have matter, which we're not talking about. We're talking about materialism. So we have the ism of the adjective, which becomes then a worldview, or it is for the worldview. So I'm going to use the word spiritualism, though there isn't such a satisfactory word, because when you say spiritism, you're mostly talking, probably, the strongest reference is the dramatic emergence of spiritualism at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. The Fox sisters are up in upstate New York, and then Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, who then opposed spiritualism while making a really strong case for spirit. And so the terminology here is slightly more complicated than in the case of materialism, whether you're dealing with a noun or an adjective or a process. Okay, so I'm going to take your lead, Matt, and stand. It gives a little, I can see people better and be seen. Matt already set the context for spirit and spiritism and spiritualism in that we are in a materialistic worldview, to the extent that we are like fish in the sea who don't even know the extent to which our thinking and behavior, our values are so permeated by materialism that it's really hard to step out. And so as soon as we turn to a non-materialist worldview, we notice that the term that we're speaking of is the negation. All right, so it's not much on its own. It really has a claim as non-materialism. Clearly, materialism is in charge, and spirit or spiritualism requires some special defense. So much so that if anyone is able to have evidence or a conviction about spirit and spiritualism, it's always in a great battle against the prior and the dominant claim of matter and materialism. And so I think generally, speaking in terms of a sociology of knowledge, spiritualism and spiritism is, for even those of us who are sympathetic toward it, have to deal with a kind of gestalt of weirdness. Okay, it's not quite really real the way matter is, which we can touch and weigh and measure, and we can build with it, and we can basically change the world, or so it seems. It's this trying. If spiritism is is claiming and trying to get others to see that, contrary to our initial and sort of ordinary perception, spirit is actually the deeper dimension. Trouble is, of course, you need people to say that there is another dimension, and that it's there and that it can be seen or heard, because it can't be touched the same way that the material world is. So it's an uneven pairing in our world, though Steiner, among others, certainly Aurobindo Teilhard and Gebser and quite a few of these evolution of consciousness thinkers, they insist that there was a time when spirit was the stronger paradigm, the dominant view, and that materialism really emerged in Steiner's view, and Aurobindo too. It's mostly in the modern world, and particularly in the modern West, as Matt was saying, that the reverse came about, so much so that if you don't know a lot of history, you could think that it was always this way. But the evolution of consciousness thinkers are saying, no, 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 it's not just a matter of different ideas, it's a matter of different way of thinking. Our way, it tends to be almost automatically in terms of the physical, the measurable, the quantitative, and the objective. Spirit, by definition, is more subtle, it's less amenable to evidence, and yet it, now I'm going to speak as a spiritist or spiritualist, it is the sort of the ultimate, the core reality that matter comes from spirit, not the other way round, and therefore it is the truer perspective of the two. And materialism, though it has great power of dominance, is actually subordinate and secondary if our culture could see that, as cultures did once, and some cultures still do, but not the one that we are in. And I think maybe that's all I'm going to say right now. Yeah, I think that's. I made my case for as best I can. Yeah. I said one more thing.
And then I'm going to rebut.
Betti says that spiritism or spiritualism denies matter, and I think that's not accurate. It as far as I can tell, with the spiritists and Blavatsky and all those people, they don't deny matter. They only are talking about what's primary and what's accessible in its own right, but not actually a denial.
So, a few things. In terms of this polarity, first of all, between matter and spirit, I would want to think of it as a polarity. We might say spirit is primary, but I worry about the language of matter being subordinate to spirit. I think maybe spirit is primary in the sense that matter is an expression, an embodiment of spirit. But spirit needs matter to have bodies, and without bodies, there's nothing happening. Even if there are subtler forms of bodies. Right. So, I mean, one way of thinking about this polarity is the difference between gravitation, as I was discussing with materialism, and levitation with spiritism. So it's a lot more difficult to think about levitation in our materialistic paradigm. We have trouble believing in it, whereas gravitation is pretty obvious. And yet, the most advanced science and physics still has no idea what gravity is. Right?
Want to tell about Brian's talk at Esalen.
Brian had just finished his PhD on gravitational dynamics. He knew everything there was to know scientifically about gravity, and he was sitting in the dust on a camping trip with his father. He picked up a stone and dropped it, and picked up the stone again and dropped it, and realized he had no idea how that was happening. He has all the abstract mathematical modeling mastered, but the phenomenon itself eluded him. So
that's when the spiritualist rushes in and says, that's because you don't recognize what is caused is not the cause is spiritual.
Right. So the materialist thinks in terms of the periodic table of elements. The spiritist thinks in terms of angelic hierarchies. Right. How different can you get?
It's different, yes. Yes. Idealism and realism is pretty different too,
yes.
as we'll see.
Yes.
Should we go? I go now.
Idealism.
Yeah. Okay. So.
The indigenous cultures, do you consider them as a part of spiritism or?
Which cultures?
Indigenous.
Oh, indigenous. Well, see, like I said before, this is a picture of the current world, modern world, where we think in terms of abstract concepts. So to use this to understand indigenous consciousness, I think is difficult. It's not meant for that, I
think
say.
more and more, though, shamanism is a major worldview in our culture.
Yes. It wasn't in 1914.
It would be 13.
Yeah.
But I don't think neither Matt nor I think that it's at all evidential that there are 12 worldviews.
Yeah.
A couple of these clearly spill into something else and maybe don't stand fully on their own, and we could definitely think of other worldviews that, yeah. I mean, pragmatism is a worldview. Gnosticism, I think feminism is a worldview. There are others that we could, if we were starting from scratch, we might make a different chart, a different Copernican universe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a way in which this whole exercise itself presupposes maybe an anthroposophical worldview. And there are other ways of approaching these questions that this whole project would need to be brought into dialogue with.
Right.
Yeah.
And Steiner doesn't mention anthroposophy in that lecture. It's a lecture to the Anthroposophical Society in 1914 in Berlin. But he doesn't finish with, you know, as I would. Now that you've traveled around, you've seen these 11, now here's the real deal, you know, etc. Which he didn't do, and I think that was terrific.
Drew, and then we'll move.
Just real quick, is what of these? Where would you see animism fit? I mean, I think shamanism is a good description.
Animism
of the
is
indigenous
it?
worldview, but animism.
Animism,
As well, and is that the same as psychism,
I was thinking
or
of
is
the
it something-
Numa.
So
Animism could be phenomenalism.
it's hard because the psychism and phenomenalism are in a polar relationship with one another. Phenomenalism has to do with perceiving the beauty of the outside world, and like Schiller has a poem where he talks about beauty's morning gate, referencing the sunrise, and that's like a portal into a mystery. And phenomenalists are really sort of enraptured by the beauty of the cosmos. So it's an outward-facing worldview, whereas psychism is the polar opposite that's looking inward into the depths of the psyche for the beauty within. And you think of depth psychology. It's a very inward, feeling-focused worldview, although psychism does relate to this notion of a world soul. When you recognize the depths of your own soul, you also, Betti talks about how this naturally opens out into a sense of a world soul, so that might connect with animism. So, you know, it's interesting to try to fit these into this circle. But
One of the lines I especially appreciated is Betti says, but the person of the psychic worldview needs one of these paradigms that will bring them out into their social world and the affirmation of the external world, because they're living in the psyche, right? They need the cosmos. Title of a good book.
yeah.
Right. Okay, maybe I'll try to do idealism. So when Matt sent his first draft of the pairs, I wrote back and said, "But what, Matt? Wait a minute! You give a whole course on idealism. Don't you want to do idealism?" And I would say in the spirit of the task, Matt decided to do the opposite in a good dialectic.
I also just finished teaching German idealism for
There we go.
Intro to PCC, and you know, it was only a half hour ago that I untangled myself after all the knots that Hegel got me tied up into. So,
Okay.
idealism is all yours.
Okay. Well, it's not as though I'm unfamiliar. I wrote a dissertation on S. Savapalli Radhakrishnan, who is a Indian Hegelian, right? And I published my first publications on Sri Aurobindo, who's an Indian idealist. In fact, the two of them are the two really great philosophical figures of Indian 20th century philosophy. So I've thought a lot about idealism. And so I'd like to give a little bit of a feel for this. When you say idealism, you almost, I think, automatically think historically. Oh, idealism, I know about that. I read Plato. That's the right place to start. Plato was a great idealist. And I think we should think about, I'm going to stand again. I think we should think about idealism as a solution. So Plato saw the conflict of virtues and values in operation leading to terrible injustice. not the least of unjust deeds was the execution of his teacher Socrates. So he was desperate to find the definition of virtues which would stand still, which could be identified and defined and referred to. So here we are, we're in all this conflict and everything's changing and there's competing ideas and lots of skepticism, and some people were even pushing skepticism as the norm, and we need some standard, something that we can point to and say, it says here, like we're supposed to do with the Constitution, all right? But not flawed at all. It would be the pure concept, and not one that sort of we took samples, but one that we intuit in its own right. This is love or truth or beauty or justice, and we have grasped in its purity and in its unchanging reality. That was his ideal. And he set out to write what he thought Socrates would have written or said. But as he went along, as happens, the student emerges, right, and becomes equal to the teacher, and on a good day maybe even goes beyond the teacher. And so by the time we get to the Symposium and the Republic, we have superb document which establishes the believability, perhaps even the necessity, of an idealist worldview. And Plato says, if we are going to have a just society, we will need all the parts in the right place, and the relationship among them must be conform to the ideal of justice. Ideal is that ideal is the beginning of idealism. And then Plotinus also then, 6 centuries later, and not in a religious worldview, but in a Greek religious or Greek spiritual worldview, sees ideals sort of in a realm, very much like the upper story of Plato, in a realm called nous. This is the realm of ideas which create the world. They come from the absolute, and they are kind of a plural absolute, very like the concept of Atman in relation to Brahman in the Indian tradition. So these are where ideals can be seen by thinking. And Augustine, then in the Christian context, a student of Plotinus after a dramatic life, he then comes to see that Plato and Plotinus recognize something really profound and foundational, namely that ideas live in the mind of God. And so this revelation of Christian revelation is a deepening and a making more vivid on earth, in human life, the ideas which are ideals in the mind of God. So then we get to the Renaissance, as Matt was saying before, and several things happen. One is that there's the beginning of nominalism, where the ideas which are ideals become names. They aren't realities. They are names that have a certain arbitrariness to them, so much so that by the time we get to the 20th century, there's scarcely any philosophical belief in ideals that have a reality independent of a social, cultural context that creates them and supports them. So idealism has this great history, but for various reasons, probably several of which Matt will speak about, for several reasons, idealism is sort of, I want to say, fighting for its life, all right? Because the ideals are real, they are knowable, they're necessary, and they are mostly denied in our culture in favor of naming, just learning how to speak language. When you, like Wittgenstein, if you learn the language, you learn what you need to know about reality, about the human world and the natural world. It's a matter of, philosophy, certainly idealist philosophy, has transitioned to anthropology, essentially. So, but doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that in our culture we have lost something extremely valuable and in need of rescue, which is what some of these great spiritual thinkers are trying to do. I think I'm going to turn to you.
Thanks, Robert. You almost had me convinced. So, the realist says to the idealist that these ideals, the ideal of the good, it's great, but how do we actualize it? Whitehead inherits so much of Plato and values Plato deeply, but says, wait a minute, Plato, you're saying that these abstract ideas are more real than our actual embodied experience of the world? Plato was more complicated than that. His thought is more nuanced. If you read the Symposium, it's not like he's denying the body. It's not like he's denying beauty. It's not like he's denying our actual experience. But what a realist like Whitehead wants to say is that these ideal forms are deficient in actuality, and they become what they were meant to be when they ingress or they incarnate into our actual experience. Whitehead was giving a lecture with an idealist at Harvard. I'm forgetting his name. They were sort of co-teaching, and at one point Whitehead got so fed up with the overly idealistic perspective.
I'd love to know who this is.
I'll let Robert know who it is when I get home tonight. But Whitehead said, wait a minute. If you want to know what the real is, you have to play rugby. You have to have been tackled in rugby. And Whitehead was a star rugby player when he was in high school and college.
I didn't know it.
External reality exists, right? It knocks us over sometimes. And, Betti and Steiner talk about realism as it's the human worldview par excellence, they say. Now, there's a naive form of realism. Say, when we come into the world as children, not as Cartesian egos doubting the existence of the external world, right? We come in to human form as infants and grow through childhood, taking for granted that we are in a world and it's real, right? And we gradually develop this capacity for inwardness to reflect and intuit maybe something beyond. But we start as realists. We move through all of these different worldviews. And what Betti is suggesting, and building on Steiner, is that we can come back to realism after this journey, this circuitous journey, and realize a higher form of realism. Now, Steiner has a participatory understanding of the mind's relationship to reality that is an expression of this higher form of realism. There's a scandal in philosophy that I want to mention, though, before we get to the higher realism, which has to do with the way that modern philosophers, influenced by Descartes and Kant, doubted the existence of the external world and gave rise to this new form of idealism, transcendental idealism, where in the 20th century, a philosopher that I know Robert doesn't like very much, Heidegger, said about Kant, who said we needed, Kant was really troubled by this need to prove the existence of the external world. And Heidegger looks at that and says, wow, the need to prove the existence of the external world, there couldn't be a better denunciation of modern philosophy than the fact that Kant needs to prove that the external world exists. How far have we fallen? I mean, this is Heidegger's perspective. So there's a higher realism here where we move, maybe doubt is a phase that we need to move through as we develop this inward sense of self-consciousness. We doubt our experience of the material world. We realize that in order to have knowledge, we do need to, even Whitehead says, make reference to these ideal forms that are eternal, that don't change. Steiner talks about the world as requiring consciousness in order to achieve completion, that the world without consciousness is incomplete. He says, the whole world, apart from the human being, is an enigma. The world enigma as such. And the human being is its solution.
That's right, yeah.
So in other words, the world would be incomplete without our conscious knowledge of it. So Steiner says that knowledge does not belong only to a person, but to the being and growth of the world. So rather than knowledge being something just inside of us, I mean, the materialist would say it's just in our brain, it's a firing of neurons. The idealist would say there's this rational intellect that's participating in the realm of eternal forms. It's not in this world. The realist is saying that knowledge is a completion of a circuit that runs through our being out into the world and back again. And that when we develop a deep understanding of the growth of a plant, say, as Goethe did in his theory of the metamorphosis of plants, the world itself has achieved a sense of completion that it wouldn't have had without the human being's participation in bringing a consciousness to the growth of this plant. So this is a realism that doesn't deny ideas, doesn't deny the thinking process, but says that the thinking process is itself a function of the world process. And the goal here is that the realist isn't denying idealism or any of these other worldviews, but integrating them.
And what is it that the realist says is real that others see as unreal?
The world of becoming. If the world is a process of growth,
Okay.
the idealist would say, well, it's changing. And if it's changing, it's not eternal, and only the eternal is real. And so, the realist wouldn't deny that the realm of ideas is participating. Aristotle, unlike Plato, said that the forms are in the things. Plato is saying, no, they're before them. They're what allow there to be things. And Aristotle's saying, well, we need to, he has it's called hylomorphism, right? The hule or hyle is literally wood in Greek, but Aristotle uses this for matter. And morph, meaning form, hylomorphism is this notion that matter and form need each other. Just like spirit and matter need each other. And so the realist wants to say that if you're making ideas preeminent and saying that the world is just full of pale imitations of these ideal forms, that you're missing the participatory the participatory understanding of knowledge that draws on forms but integrates them with actual existing beings.
And so they are, in Whitehead, they are there to be drawn upon, but
Yes.
how are they there? What is the ontology of these forms? Are they mental? Are they, what status do they have?
Well, now we're getting in the nuances of Whitehead. They're possibilities. They're possibilities awaiting actuality. And they do exist in the mind of God, for Whitehead too. God
Okay.
is an actuality.
Yeah. Good. That's a good answer. Yeah.
So I believe Barry was more in line with Aristotle on this than Plato.
He was.
And he used the word inscendent rather than transcendent.
I like that. Thank you. Inscendent, that's the word I was looking for.
Yep. He definitely became more and more Aristotelian and more Confucian, which is comparable. And the Chinese version, as I think of it, Confucius is to Lao Tzu as Aristotle is to Plato. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we left time for questions, comments, objections, corrections, whatever's. Oh, yeah.
I have a question about what you were just talking about.
I'd have to come closer. I can't hear you.
I was going to ask what Matt was just talking about with idealism versus realism being the forms outside the world versus going from inside the world. Is there any scholars who talk about it being both? Because I think in my mind, I'm always running on embryology. And in the fetus, the thing that is driving, that is creating this did come from the inside, but it also came from the outside. And there is that co-create. I'm just curious to see.
Well, I mean, it's why I am so taken by Whitehead's thought, because I really think he captures this polarity well, where he really wants to emphasize that what's preeminent is not the forms independent of this world, but the way that the forms participate in giving definite form to this world, right?
He's as integral as anybody.
I like to think so.
Yeah, I like to think so too.
You know, Aristotle is thinking, he's a Platonist too, Aristotle. It's not like he's denying Plato. He's just really focused on observing the natural world, understanding processes of growth and development, like embryology. Aristotle is an embryologist, among many other things. And he wants to understand how form enters into processes of growth, not just leaving the forms in their static, eternal heaven, but how do they partake in earth, in the plant realm, in the animal realm, to give direction and shape and purpose to these processes of growth. So it's already there in Aristotle, this integration you're looking for,
Yeah.
That piece reminds, sorry, I was talking too much, but that specific piece reminds me of Rupert Sheldrake and morphic resonance and morphic fields and morphogenesis.
Yeah. I think Sheldrake is probably a really good example of a realist in this conception. I think he is.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I was thinking of another argument from materialism. I think it's Charles Taylor. He gives a great argument for like the heroism of like the materialist worldview in terms of ethics, or like valuing human life, like not punching through to a transcendent realm too early. But like people like Sartre or maybe Sartre's not the best example, but that human life, because it's the only thing we've got, takes on a certain sort of heroic quality that wouldn't have if you had this sort of transcendent view of an afterlife. So I think the moral intensity or the ethical intensity of our life has a possibility that perhaps it wouldn't have otherwise if you're in that view.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean,
I can see the opposite. You know, if we didn't have these ideals, then we wouldn't be able to deal with the material world in an ideal, a creative, and in a way that is free from its demands.
I mean, think of someone like Nietzsche, or like people work out sort of the death of God kind of after Foucault, people like that, who are striving for or maybe Derrida's better, striving for an ethical life that is more inclusive. I think in the 20th century, Marx, yeah, right.
I mean,
it's the perfect example.
the ethics of materialism.
Yeah.
Excellent example.
Yeah.
But major tyrants who are anti-spiritual brought horrific suffering in the world. And people who believe in spirit couldn't compare to Mao or Stalin or Pol Pot for evil.
Right, but then you have someone like Hegel who also had racist ideas about, like, I mean, so there's all these.
Yeah, and the role that occultism and esotericism played among the upper echelons of Nazism. So spiritism has a dark side too.
So I think it's this integration of the two that maybe can bring up a better end there.
That's what we're trying to say. Thank you. Carol.
Chad has his hand up earlier.
Yeah, just to follow up on this thread, it seems as though our experience is a paradoxical one, in that, like you started off with, in that you need both, and we need both, and it seems as though the physical organism is a reality that our experience is dependent upon, and yes, our consciousness and our morals are also clearly dependent upon our psychological, spiritual navigation of the world. But to further on the question, I think that I also started was, are there any theorists who don't emphasize one primary to the other? Because it seems like one, everybody kind of falls back on ideals first, material world first, but is there any theorist who says no, they come into existence together, that you can't have one without the other, not just that material world is divergent with others?
But I don't think Steiner intended for us to give up our proclivity for one or more of these views. Just like we have natal charts and we come in with certain predispositions, certain potentials that we can realize, certain challenges that we face, we're each predisposed to inhabit, usually not just one, but a couple of these worldviews that we feel most comfortable with, and that's okay. The challenge here is to not deny the legitimacy of the others and to recognize that your own tendencies, your own understanding of the importance of psychism can be enhanced by coming into dialogue, with your polar opposite, the phenomenalist, right? And with the other worldviews. So it's not a call to give up our sense of being allured by one of these views. Like, we should fully inhabit our worldview because, as Steiner said, they're all justified. It's just a matter of not allowing ourselves to become one-sided or exclusive in our affirmation of it, right? And perhaps in the course of human evolution, we will move towards being more integrated beings where we can sort of inhabit all of these worldviews at once. But we're not there yet, and that's okay.
Not so okay, but it's where we are.
It's where we are.
Yeah, yeah.
Carol.
Well, first of all, thank you. This was wonderful. So picking up on Drew and Deepak's questions about animism and shamanism. Sorry, my brain is half asleep. It seemed to me that maybe there's siblings of spiritism, and picking up on the feeling and willing aspects that are so important to Steiner. Seemed like animism would fit more like on the left side with feeling, left side of spiritism along with feeling, and shamanism would fit on the right side with willing, sort of, as siblings of spiritism. That just seemed like what would work in my mind and my limited experience of shamanism and my work. And then when Matt, you just reminded us of the natal chart sort of thing. So can you tell us, please, what are the how do you say it, zodiac signs for all of them?
Briefly, materialism is Cancer, sensualism is Leo, phenomenalism is Virgo, realism is Libra, monadism, wait, I skipped one. Dynamism is Scorpio, monadism is Sagittarius, spiritism is Capricorn, pneumatism is Aquarius, psychism is Pisces, idealism is Aries, rationalism is Taurus, and mathematism is Gemini. And Steiner does intend for us to draw the archetypal correlations here between the signs and the worldviews.
And the two of you,
where do we fit?
Yeah,
which are my most?
Yeah, what are your signs?
Oh, I'm an Aquarius.
Okay.
I'm a Leo.
Steiner does specifically say that your natal chart does not correspond necessarily to your worldview proclivities. That this has to do with a different phase of your development than where the planets were and what signs when you were born.
Do you have a sort of worldview
I mean, I
Would you
have.
like to share?
I would love to. I feel most comfortable. Now it's really hard that I have to decide. I mean, a realism, I think, is what I strive for. But phenomenalism and psychism, I really like that polarity. I'm a panpsychist, the philosophical school of thought, and that seems to me to really be in this axis.
He includes multitudes.
Dynamism is like Nietzsche. It's the will to power. It's the sense of everything being process.
It's also Bergson.
And Bergson.
Elan Vital.
And Elan Vital.
And I'm very close to Bergson, not so much to Nietzsche, but I am to dynamism
Yeah.
because of Bergson.
Monadism is like Leibniz's understanding of the universe made of infinitely many monads. That's also kind of similar to Whitehead with the infinity of actual occasions
Right.
of experience.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all good.
So, Matt, at one point, I thought you decided that his use of the zodiac was metaphorical, but it seems like now you're saying it's more than that.
That was me trying to describe the correlation. Yeah. I think I heard someone. Did you want to say which ones you feel drawn to, Robert?
I'm an incurable realist. With a interesting, a heavy dose of idealism. How about this? I think that idealism is the most realistic. I actually do think that.
And there were ways in which Robert's description of idealism had some relationship to psychism and rationalism.
Yeah.
And my description of realism has some relationship to phenomenalism and dynamism. So these are, when you look at the worldviews next to one another, they shade into one another, and it's difficult. That's one of the reasons we avoided doing all 12 is because it would be really hard.
Right.
Someone's online. I think maybe Rick has a question.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Very well.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot for taking on such an ambitious evening as discussing 12, a whole spectrum of worldviews in just an hour. I noticed that as Matt presented his not his, but the worldviews that he was assigned, like materialism or realism, that rather than spending too much time with what I think would be the mainstream realist, modern realist, or the mainstream materialist, you went pretty quickly, Matt, to, like with materialism, you kind of climaxed in talking about the incarnation, and when you were talking about realism, it was very participatory and kind of incorporating idealism into it in a what I felt was your presentations were imbued with a kind of 13th outlook, in a sense, one that that was enriching whatever you were describing with perspectives that came from Whitehead or Steiner or Christian incarnationalism and so forth, and in a way this brings up the challenge. In a way, I think you that you started with, which was how do we really say these 12 perspectives, which I think really reflect the view of Steiner of 12 perspectives that were available to him in the history of philosophy at that point, because as you say now, we would put a number of other candidates up there that have emerged. But I think we really can't, we can sympathetically or empathically enter into and articulate these different worldviews, but I don't think we can I don't think we can completely get rid of the fact that we are always kind of triangulating and integrating our these various perspectives into yet another perspective, which we feel called to articulate, because you really were presenting yet another perspective that draws on many others, but is not. You're never limited by any one of those, and so in that sense, they're not all equally justifiable. Every one of them is kind of being qualified and placed into a more integral, evolutionary, participatory, characteristically PCC worldview.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that reflection, Rick. It's true. You know, I could have, when I introduced materialism, really dwelled on some of I have a group of philosophers who are materialists that I really love to use as foils, like Daniel Dennett, for example. Brilliant writer, clear thinker, thinks that consciousness is actually non-existent.
It's the brain.
He thinks that consciousness is a user illusion, and he's very convincing, but reading him is exciting for me, even though I disagree with everything he says, because it helps me understand my own position better. And it is difficult. I guess what draws me to thinkers like Dennett is that I trust his sense of his virtuous call to articulate a worldview that he thinks will be of benefit. And I really feel that in all of his work. He's a wonderful human being.
Yeah.
Wonderful human being. And a materialist, right? So I feel like I didn't know about Steiner's 12 Views or this whole project when I first recognized how, I have this great relationship with a thinker who I completely disagree with. But we can connect as human beings. But it is hard for me to do justice to materialism without already sort of slipping over into these other perspectives. And like as Drew mentioned when I was reading Goethe's poem, it's like, well, spirit's right there already. To even understand why matter is so spiritually powerful.
This is what Rick says about Brian's cosmology, that it's already numinous, or shot through and through. So it's not a materialism.
Right.
It's about the cosmos,
Yeah.
but it's a numinous cosmos. Right. And Marx's materialism is a Jewish prophetic servant of suffering labor.
Yep. On behalf of the ideal of justice,
yes.
Even if he didn't think of it as a
completely
transcendent
well,
Platonic form.
Eric Fromm's account of Marx does have Marx thinking of all of that. Yeah, the introduction to the 1844 manuscripts. So we have time for another comment or question. Yeah, Deepak.
So it's two questions, but they're related. So one is, looking into this, what do you think is integral? Integral is holding the tension between the two, or integral is holding everything together, all of them. And then the related question to that is, as a human we are incarnated, with, as you said, with a natal chart. But are there evidences or examples of any avatars, the divine incarnations, who have held all of these together?
Well, I'm guessing that you
can do the
think
avatar.
you know the answer. I mean, we all study many thinkers and philosophical positions, but as we go along, one speaks to us with increasing depth and satisfaction that we really want to stand with, we want to recommend. And so, I mean, my list is Steiner, Royce, James, Bergson, Whitehead, and probably some others, but those are core. And when I go outside of them, say I read existentialism, or which should have been up there, then I look for what I know these other thinkers have, and I'm impressed but not satisfied.
Yeah.
And I think that when I hear Matt talk about Schelling or Whitehead, I have this feeling that Matt has found his philosophical home. And other thinkers in his life, if I may say, are interesting. Like Dennett is interesting because of his brilliance and his clarity and his trying to be helpful, but he doesn't give the depth, and for that matter, the height that Matt and I and people in PCC generally are looking for and are convinced of. So we're looking for that numinous in matter, or numinous in social life, and numinous in art, and and all of our thinkers, we want depth and scope and depth is what I think of very often. Scope and depth. A book that influenced me very significantly in graduate school, I took a course in metaphysics, and we studied Stephen Pepper, World Hypotheses. And I remember thinking through these four that I thought, these are really world adequate philosophies. Then he talked about several others that were less so. And I said, that's right, they are less so. They're specialized. You know, it's like the existentialist comes at a certain time for a certain set of, a certain task of trying to figure out what happened to Europe in the two wars, and alienation, and as a result of the evolution. I think existentialism is a really profound response, but it doesn't solve all my questions or all my commitments. I want to have something more, which is actually fortunate that there are two different kinds of existentialism. One gives one kind, the other gives the other solution. But to my mind, it's a smaller ism than some of these others, but a good one, and I wouldn't want to live without it. Matt, you get the last word.
It's 8:29. What would integral be? I think like being willing to try the Cabernet and to try the Merlot. You know, if you really like IPA, try, you know, a Pilsner and see, maybe it'll speak to you. And sampling all of the different philosophies. You know, you mentioned existentialism, and it is up here. Psychism, Betti describes as where existentialism would live. He gives Kierkegaard as an example. And I remember reading Kierkegaard for the first time in college, and just I was devoted to him. I wanted to read everything he wrote. I don't hang out with Kierkegaard anymore at all.
Right.
But I went really deep into that, you know? And one of these days I'm going to get tired of Whitehead. It's going to happen, and I'm going to move on to something else.
I actually wonder if
You wonder if that's true?
I think you get tired of Kierkegaard because he's an exaggeration.
Yeah.
But Whitehead is sublimely sensible and coherent and balanced.
Yeah. Well, our Zoom people just lost us, but that's okay.
That's their privilege, and we've lost you, and you've lost us because our time is up.
Our time's up.
Good. Thank you for coming. So were they scheduled for an hour and a half?
I don't know why. I think it crashed, but it crashed right at the right time.
I'll say.